beautiful community is hello present. Vlad is hello present. We're going to talk about the diminishing power of the Putin regime by reading through a large part of a piece by Tatiana Stanovaya, which I'll link below. It'll be somewhat useless because it's in Russian, but I'll link it below anyway if you want to refer to it. And we'll just use it as a way to make a couple of wider remarks about where the Putin regime is at. I want to share this with you because it's speculatively driving in the right direction. Now, after the war, or perhaps even before the war, I said that a possible reason, among others, for the war is Putin losing power relative to his inner circle, his arbitration, his refereeing role relative to his inner circle diminishing, and him wanting to grasp some of that power back. And then the phrase that I used after the war for quite a few months is that Putin had grasped that power back and he had now more power in his hands, but it was more fragile. We felt that to some extent, for instance, during the Prigozhin mutiny. Now, something else I said around 2021, perhaps, on the main channel in the video called Inside the Mind of Putin, before I was regularly talking on YouTube, is that Putin has no domestic policy. And that was an exaggerated statement to illustrate the fact that Putin's incapacity and irrelevance in domestic policy had grown, just as his all-encompassing and reckless power in foreign policy had grown too. Quick algorithmic remark and a sort of a health safety thing. Understand that on social media platforms, most conversations about the fragility of the Putin regime or the fragility of the Russian economy are algorithm conditioned. That's to say, they're not right or wrong, they are caused by the algorithm. That's to say, they are commercial products or pieces of entertainment or pieces of advocacy, all respectable, but only some of them are analyses. Right? And an analysis that is genuine analysis can then be right or wrong. But you can't be right or wrong if your content is caused by the algorithm, in the sense that if I'm an influencer on Instagram and I'm posing with Pepsi over Dr. Pepper because that's what the algorithm tells me to do, there is no further question beyond that about whether I actually think that objectively the taste of Pepsi is better than the taste of Dr. Pepper. By the way, be careful with soft drinks. But that's not a question because it's not a piece of content presents an aesthetic or a taste-based judgment about the two. It just picks one on the basis of what's going to, go forth algorithmically better. Know that. So ask questions about content. Is this an opinion that could be right or wrong as an analysis? Or is this something, perhaps a piece of entertainment or a piece of advocacy, that is simply caused by the algorithm, right? And you can work that out for yourself and you can say that some things are grey too. Tatiana Stanovaya. This is going to be long. We're going to be here probably 30 minutes at least. So I don't know if you want to strap in or you want to check in with the next video. I'm sure I'll do a Vlad version of this analysis on the main channel, health allowing. It's going to have more brevity. But I do think this is constructive because I am paying a lot of attention to comments and emails and DMs, and what's the state of things in Russia is a question I'm getting more and more, several times a day, again. So, the war has begun to deeply influence the very nature of Putin's leadership, the behavior of the elites, and the adoption and implementation of state decisions. What externally seemed like a fortress is actually gradually transforming into a self-reconstructing structure where the supporting role of Putin's institutions and Putin himself is being devalued and replaced. The solid regime has transitioned into a state of wild Putinism, where the role of central authority and the Kremlin has become blurred, while the drive from below, on the contrary, plays a key role. Now, as we go on, I'm going to somewhat omit the examples, which will frustrate some of you, but save us a lot of time. Partly because we've talked about some of the examples already, and partly because, if we talk about how Kuzmin Kuzminovich has conflicted with Ivan Nikiforovich, you need to explanation of who these people are and what they're doing and so on. So that's how we're going to cut space in the article. Even before the war, discussions in Russia had begun about the desacralization of Vladimir Putin's authority. And how I talk about the sacralization of Putin's authority is that he's the only institution in the land with perceived legitimacy. Discussions in Russia began about the desacralization of Putin's authority and the reduction of his role as an arbiter. And again, when you talk about people who closely follow the regime, you're going to inevitably end up in this discourse of Putin as arbiter, of Putin as referee, largely because one tends to converge on these kinds of descriptions, observing Putin over the years, outsourcing power to elites, witnessing them conflict, and then with a certain degree of proactivity, and more recently with more passivity, than coming in and trying to arbitrate and referee some of these conflicts. The reduction of Putin's role as arbiter, his loss of interest in routine matters, and his distancing from non-strategic decision-making. A quick apology. Normally I would translate for us, but this would be so slow if I did it on the spot, and I can't do it for health reasons by simply rewriting the piece. So this has been thrown into an auto-translate, so I'm apologizing for that. But I'm trying to be conscious if we run into sort of really awkward mistranslations along the way. I have listened to the piece in the original. This was especially evident. All right, Putin has long and actively delegated responsibility to the cabinet of ministers, governors, and the central bank, special services, and so on. This was especially evident during the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you, YouTube, for now putting a disinformation warning on this video. But it is also noticeable today. Putin reserves only those matters that, as his press reserves for himself, only those matters that, as Mr. Peskov likes to say, are presidential level. The zones of manual control have narrowed to very specific cases, but even there, the president's personal involvement becomes increasingly superficial. It provides no guarantees to the involved parties. That's quite a strong claim. Putin's involvement provides no guarantees to the involved parties. Putin's involvement in the conflict between elites provides no guarantees to the involved parties. If, for instance, Putin intervenes on one side, that does not mean that that one side will necessarily prevail. That's what Tatiana is saying. The current state of the regime can be compared to the current state of Putin as an institution can be compared to the supporting structure of a house. These are the load-bearing walls on which everything stands. In the eyes of Russian elites, even those who are negative toward the president, Putin is the guarantee against collapse. This, by the way, is to be distinguished from being a guarantor of stability. Since the annexation of Crimea in 2014, stability as such has begun to change. Predictable development based on state capital and still a market economy with a politically conserved system has been supplemented by geopolitical shocks. There have been quite a few. Syria, intervention in the US elections, the Skripals, alarming cartoons about Russia's developing new weapons, wave of sanctions, simmering Donbass crisis, and so on. The beginning of the full-scale war in 2022 Feb was the strongest shock, but it did not disrupt this stable internal development. According to the results of the first year, many elite members were pleasantly surprised. The system not only didn't collapse, but also unexpectedly quickly adapted to the new reality. At the same time, the labor market's condition, low unemployment and high wages, and economic growth, albeit due to large-scale military injections, led to the population feeling better than ever. According to the Levada Center, Russians' assessment of their life situation improved after a slight decline in 2023 and approached their peak levels. The survey was conducted before the August invasion of Ukraine into the Kursk region, but this event did not fundamentally change the picture. So I'm going to say that this is a cursory mention of the latest Levada polling, but I'm going to largely call bullshit on it. And there is a tendency among the expert community to call bullshit on it, so I'm probably in a kind of a soft majority here. And I call bullshit on it because the Russian population, first of all, has such a collapse of normative thought, as Greg Udin often points out, that they cannot conceive of any alternative to the present status quo. Right? So as soon as that normative obstruction is liberated by practical possibilities becoming palpable, all the current thinking can then dissolve. So you've got to be careful about not forgetting that. The second thing you've got to remember is that even though Levada designated a foreign agent, they play a functional role of generating a perception of public opinion which may not exist, more than representing a public opinion that exists. So you've got to be careful about this, because what I actually think is that the majority of Russians, apart from one significant change I'm observing, but the majority of Russians remain neither for nor against the war, and neither for or against anything that Putin is doing, and neither for or against the way the economy is being run. That's just outsourced to the Kremlin. And there's much more to say here, but I'm just throwing a couple of strokes on the canvas to indicate that I'd take it with a pinch of salt that they're feeling good. I mean, the reality is that most Russians are feeling worse economically. Don't draw political conclusions from this, right? If Russians are profoundly impoverished, they will not turn on the regime. They'll support it more, probably. More than just probably, in fact. But nevertheless, I think that there is a big economic unease and a psychological consciousness of that's there, that this citation of Levada is not reflecting. And there is an element of, so far so good wishful thinking that's an evasion of the fact that there's a trend in a bad direction in which you don't want to look. So that's a bit more real relative to the Russians are happier than ever story. I beg your pardon for the interruption. Thus, while outside Russia geopolitical storm rages, deadly for Russian actors, within the country it is entirely possible to live and prosper fully, sometimes even better than before. We have to be careful, I think, about saying that too strongly. This manifests the political value of Putin as a supporting structure. It in itself does not define much in terms of daily routine, and doesn't define much in terms of business life. The institution of Putin, but it protects against externally unfriendly geopolitical storms. I'm seeing the auto-translate trouble us here, so I'm going to try to take over a bit if we continue being in trouble. Of course, many in the elite dream of ending the war and engaging in peace negotiations. Now, is this actually true? Yeah, it is. But to even contemplate taking any practical steps about this, you could actually need a non-depoliticized population. And as that's absent, these elites are going to be getting in line. But simultaneously, fear of defeat prevails within the establishment. So that's what I just forgot to mention. There is one sense in which Russian public opinion has evolved, and that is that the depoliticized blob tendentiously tends to think whatever is going on with this war, we don't know why it's happening. Hopefully it's justified, but doesn't matter, it's not up to us. But fingers crossed, it would be good if it didn't end up in disaster for Russia, because that would screw us over. So there is no a tendency to fear and hope to avoid some kind of catastrophic defeat for Russia, right? Everything else remains a matter of inferred justification, or we don't know why this war is happening. We don't know if there are good reasons for it. But whatever this is all about, hopefully there's no catastrophic defeat here. For us, it'd be good to avoid that. I think that is creeping more into the sentiments of the depoliticized blob. The war has gone so far that a stable, though not consensual understanding has formed that now the country must stand to the end. Among the elites, she means, I think. However, few could explain what to the end means. But it is certainly not defeat in the war, because in such a scenario, large-scale financial, economic, and political obligations would fall on Russia. These are likely to be destructive in terms of the internal Russian perception of the situation, and for the economy, the political system, and for the state as an institution. However, this merit of Putin as a supporting structure has a very unpleasant and dangerous downside for the elites. The war devalues effective political leadership, which is fundamentally significant for the system's stability and predictability. Putin, Tatiana Stanovaya says, is much less involved in internal processes. This trend was noticeable even before the war, and I agree with that very much. But now, much more existential conflicts are arising within the country, such as, for instance, the rebellion of Evgeny Prigozhin in June 2023. Putin's sensitivity to internal political issues, painful for the elite and society, has notably decreased. He increasingly gives signals for decisions and proposals, not particularly calculating long-term consequences. When it comes to secondary issues for him, Putin is increasingly subject to external influence. In practice, the situation leads to the dominance of decisions closely linked to the priorities of individual players or institutions. This is clearly seen in how foreign company assets are distributed, how the cycle of arrests is accelerated. So the cycle of arrests is itself a part of an inter-elite conflict, including of high-ranking officials, how privatization deals from the 90s are being reviewed, or even how personnel decisions are made. This forms a new reality that forces players to adapt to life under conditions of insecurity and unpredictability. By analogy with wild capitalism, one can talk about the onset of wild Putinism, where no one knows what to expect tomorrow and everyone, regardless of positions and titles, is ready for arrests at any moment. Whereas in previous years, political risks could be borne by initiative, right? You could get in trouble politically for doing something proactively that was not liked by the regime. Now inaction can become dangerous. And so over the next couple of pages, Tatiana goes on to talk about the Wildberries saga, which we discussed, a form of inter-elite conflict where, one of the things we saw was actually Kadyrov coming out against the decision that was approved by Putin. Then she talks about the crawling and indecisive methods they're using to asphyxiate YouTube. And then she talks about the personnel policy. And let's actually read a couple of lines from that. The departure of Mr. Patrushev has virtually led to no serious consequences. And Mr. Belousov, who became the Minister of Defense, today looks not like a new powerful center of influence, as many had predicted, but like a nominal figure in the department where everything is decided by the familiar general staff and Putin's close associates. Now, I think that's fair, but I do think that with the appointment of Belousov and with the reshuffle around that time, it was worth talking about endgame psychology, because I believe that's what's in Putin's mind, little by little beginning to think about what shape do I want the regime to have come endgame for me, whether that's for political or biological reasons. Let's read on. With strong personalized power, the question who comes next is fundamental. But in Russian realities, not only is it impossible to predict the name of the successor, everyone is so accustomed to eternal Putin and the built-in uncertainty of the system on this issue that they begin to learn to function in a way that preserves at least something in any outcome. What she means is what the awful translation should do a better job of helping us see in the original piece. She's talking about elites hedging for a plurality of outcomes. But now let's say something psychological about not Putin, but the elites. The elites around Putin for years now, long before the war, have been in part in transit psychology, right? They've been conscious that it's time to think about how their position might be impacted, right? Not just by Putin in the medium term losing power, but by Putin's role evolving along the path to him losing power in time, right? What's going to be my position here? How do I adjust? So the idea that transit psychology is in place in the Russian elites is an analysis of mine that's I've stuck to for quite a few years, and it's certainly there today. Another issue of importance. The older Putin is, the more detached from life he seems, and the less the elites believe in his ability to guarantee a stable transfer of power. Practically all major players within the power structure live following the logic that with Putin anything can happen. Rebellions, foreign troops invading Russian territory, mass mobilization with protests, political murders, nuclear war. In this new reality, sorry, I'm just going to get a call from the YouTube algorithm here. Hi, YouTube algorithm. Oh, sorry. A nuclear war is impossible. There's no way that it could happen. Okay. So, sorry, thanks for pointing that out. So, nuclear war is an impossibility, is a complete impossibility. So, there is no such thing as increasing or decreasing nuclear risk, as the algorithm explains. So, anything can happen. In this new reality, where outside of Russia there is war and within the country a rerun of the 90s, everyone begins to build their own supporting structures. At the same time, enraged inhabitants of the building are increasingly undermining the supporting structure of their enemies inside the building, often under the guise of patriotism and fighting unreliable elements. And then there are quite a few examples, including a bit of a conversation on Mr. Medvedev engaging in various political constructions to preserve his safety and power. Because there is a main channel video on that, I'm just going to not discuss this now. On the surface, all of this seems like elements of a clearly top-down course towards stronger political control, strengthening the vertical and centralizing management. But in reality, it is not so. What is happening is war-induced fermentation of the political field, where long-simmering radicalized demands are now surfacing, both among elites and society. Forces that see promoting their own mini agendas. Translation problem. Forces are going around promoting their own mini agendas, and often repressions and bans are a product of this conflictual advancement of the mini agendas of elites. And we're dealing with means of survival, resource accumulation. In today's Russia, it no longer matters at all what will be banned tomorrow. The process begins to live its own life. And I agree with that. That a set of totalitarian threads are already rolling in that society, and in virtue of intra-elite conflict, if nothing else, they will continue to perpetuate. Contrary to the external impression, the war has not contributed to more internal political order in the system. On the contrary, it has greatly weakened those who were vulnerable and made those who were strong vulnerable. It made the vulnerable more vulnerable and made the strong somewhat vulnerable. It sharply reduced the significance of the letter of the law and led to the destabilization of legislative work, as well as to the inability to guarantee anything to anyone. The reality is that to gain just the right to exist today, one must support Putin, the war, traditional values, and be against NATO and the CIA. Now, we're accused of being sponsored by the CIA here on the channels, as you know. This is the basic identity of all legitimate entities. But for prosperity, so to be a legitimate entity, you've got to run through this script. But Stanovaya says, for prosperity, career growth, and security, this has now become insufficient. Wild Putinism, the period of Putin's late rule, when the president is only interested in war and foreign policy issues. In this period, Putin's involvement in the functioning of the country has become not only minimal, but often meaningless. The country plunged into the sharpest geopolitical confrontation with half of the world is gradually sinking internally into a kind of survival state, everyone out for themselves. Ownership redistribution is ongoing, war-driven businesses are growing rapidly, bans and criminalization of entire spheres of public life become a form of adaptation to a prolonged period of uncertainty. To this, add the military aspect, the gradual arming of various regional objects, authorities, and enterprises that do not want to rely on federal protection from shelling and drones. Everything still passes the people by, but the very nature of wild Putinism is directed, among other things, toward increasingly active interference in private life. This is already evident from what music cannot be listened to, what films cannot be watched, what programs cannot be installed, and what forms of private behavior threaten fines, prison terms, expulsion from universities, and public condemnation. Outside any plans and Kremlin designs, the country itself is moving toward a sort of a power-driven patriotic lawlessness. Where the key to success is not closeness to Putin or his associates, but the willingness to act in the logic of who is stronger is right. So the key to success is not closeness to Putin or his associates, but the willingness to act in the logic of might is right. There is a rise of various kinds of moralizers, persecutors, and other patriots with administrative or financial resources. In such a situation, it will be extremely difficult to simply stay aside, waiting for better times. The intensification of the wildness of late Putinism is facilitated by the absence of grounds for winding down the military conflict in Ukraine. The Ukrainian armed forces invasion of the Kursk region struck Russian domestic expectations for a possible start of negotiations in the near future. And the budget project introduced by the State Duma showed that there will be no decline in the country's military mobilization for not just months, but for a year and more than a year. Putin is ready to wage war using maximum resources for at least 3 more years, Stanovaya says. However, even if the military phase of the conflict were to suddenly shift to negotiations, the confrontation with the West is unlikely to decrease. And more importantly, the processes of uncontrolled, forceful patriotization of the country will not slow down. And thus, many will have to double their efforts to fight for a place in the future Russia. Invest in their own security and agenda, accumulate resources at the expense of competitors who are weaker. The country is entering a period of critical internal political transformation, where conflicts, setting traps, compromising, and attacks will become the main way of survival, most often under conservative and anti-Western slogans. The positive news in all this story is that the increasing wildness of Putinism in its hypertrophied form will simultaneously become a threat to the system itself. Sooner or later, although obviously not soon, this may open a window of opportunity for discussing war exit strategies and seeking some normalization. So, what I think we've got here is speculative, but I think that the only question is, how many steps do we want to take in this speculative direction? For me, there is no question that this speculative direction is correct analytically, right? If you make a historical comparison, there is no doubt that there are now many conflicts, machinations, repressions on a scale that couldn't have occurred under Stalin's rule, without Stalin's own involvement, that are occurring in Putin's regime, without Putin's involvement or without Putin's decisive involvement. Obviously, I'm not making a comparison between the two regimes. There is no comparison between them. Stanovaya seems absolutely right about this diminution of Putin's role as referee. I suppose one of the things that you might ask is, what does this mean by way of a coup as a possibility? And I think the answer here is that the last coup was in the early 90s, and the one before was in the mid-60s. The one in the early 90s was accompanied by extraordinary external stimulus, the collapse of the Soviet Union. Right? So you're going to need extraordinary external stimulus for elites to move, and a politicization of the population to some extent, right? And here we're always talking about a certain synchronicity, right, of a crack in the top on the top of a regime, conjoined with political proposals, bottom up, offered by some kind of oppositional leadership, that create a path out of the complete normative stasis for the population. So what I'm saying is that nothing that Stanovaya lists here is conducive to the conclusion that we're several steps away from a coup if this is the way things are going to keep going. We don't want to underestimate the extraordinary improvisatory nimbleness of the system, right? We've also seen Russia's extraordinary economic nimbleness, but we shouldn't underestimate the improvisatory nimbleness of the regime politically. Of course, you can't rule a coup out. It's something that you just can't predict. It's something that could just happen in 6 months, and boom, it's there. But to talk about anticipating it with a degree of sort of realism rather than wishful thinking, you're talking about the need of some kind of external stimulus plus an activation of the depoliticized population. Sorry, I'm increasingly incoherent. I'm a bit health drained by the end of this, but I hope this brought value. Did this bring value? Let me know in the comments. Lots of love.